Okrima Media's Polity Mtabi Madiba, political analyst Aubrey Matshiqi joins me to discuss his column, The People Have Spoken. Can you briefly explain to us why do you say until 2009 the African National Congress no longer seemed to be the liberation movement?
Well, there has been this argument that the ANC is failing to change from a liberation movement to a modern political party. It's an argument that I do not buy, because the ANC consists of multiple identities. It is part liberation movement and by law is a modern parliamentary party. There are times when it behaves like a social movement. There are times it has behaved even like an opposition party. Now, it's not that it is failing to change into a modern political party, which is the problem. The problem is that it struggles to harmonize different parts of its complex identity. So there are those in the party who rely on the liberation movement aspect, others will rely on the modern political party, parliamentary party aspect, depending on what will take them forward or will help them achieve their political goals. And especially after Polokwane, or especially in the period leading up to Polokwane and after Polokwane, what we saw and what we see today because of the factionalism is an ANC that is struggling to harmonize the different dimensions of its political identity. The second thing is that you need to look at the ANC in terms of the liberation movement model. According to the liberation movement model, the people and the liberation movement are one. But what we have seen since 2001 is a downward trend in electoral support for the ANC. So which means since 2009, we see a decoupling between the interests of the ANC, the liberation movement, and the motive force of the revolution, that is the people. Now, this decoupling manifesting in ANC losing support consistently between 2009 and this year's election is an indication that the so-called motive force of the revolution, the people, are independent, act independently, and will activate their agency to the detriment of the ANC or to the disadvantage of the ANC if the ANC no longer delivers on their interests as citizens. And this explains why the ANC over the past 3 elections has been losing about 4% per election. In fact, since 2009, it has lost 12%. To fall to where it is today at 57.5%. And that has happened precisely because its supporters, the people, have shown that they can act independently and make independent electoral and political choices to the disadvantage of the liberation movement.
In the May 8th national and provincial elections, electoral support for the ruling party declined even further below 60%. Can it possibly be because of empty promises to the voters?
Well, by the time Jacob Zuma exits as head of state in February 2018, it had become obvious to the ANC that the gap of trust between it and those it governs, between it and the people, had become so wide that if Jacob Zuma were to be head of state at the time of the May 8 elections, the ANC would have lost, would have fallen below 50%. So the reason the ANC removes him as head of state, it is precisely because it wanted to save itself from the fate of, or ignominious fate of falling below 50%. Now, of course, what has happened is that, yes, the ANC has succeeded in not falling below 50%, but for the first time since 1994 has fallen below 60%. Now, if this trend holds, in the next 2 or 3 elections, the ANC is going to fall below 50.
And everyone has been going on about how President Cyril Ramaphosa has saved the ANC. Ramaphosa produced the worst general election results the ANC has ever had, losing 19 seats in the process. Can we really say Ramaphosa has indeed saved the ANC?
Well, I think it is your grandchildren who will be truthful and objective about whether he did or not. Because 2 things have happened. His detractors argue that for the first time, the ANC has fallen below 60%, and therefore he should either be blamed for that performance or he should not be credited as much as his supporters are doing. Because his supporters are arguing that it could have been worse. Were it not for the Ramaphosa factor, the ANC would have done much worse. Now, as I say, it is your grandchildren who will be much more objective about whether he did save the ANC or not, or whether the ANC could have done better or worse because of the Ramaphosa factor.
Do you think the ANC's future is bright enough with Ramaphosa as the leader?
Well, I still maintain that Ramaphosa is not the man for this moment. I still maintain that he would have made quite a good president as a successor to Nelson Mandela. Because I think as a leader, he is of the mold that South Africa needed at the time. He is of the mold that would have done much better with regard to the reconciliation project. But not in the manner that Thabo Mbeki tried, because Thabo Mbeki had a different conception, or has a different conception of reconciliation. To him, reconciliation is not about black and white people cheering the same national team for 2 hours and then going back to their different social and economic realities afterwards. Thabo Mbeki argued that reconciliation will not happen until the lot of those who are oppressed is ameliorated. In other words, until the material conditions of those who were oppressed during apartheid are altered sufficiently, reconciliation is not going to happen in South Africa. Ramaphosa, to me, comes from the mold that puts much more emphasis on what I call the touchy-feely kumbaya type of reconciliation. And that reconciliation is wearing quite thin because those who are oppressed want to see changes in their lived reality. And I am not convinced that Ramaphosa is the man for this moment, a moment in which South Africa is going through its deepest economic crisis since 1994, a moment in which it has become so vulnerable that it is losing its national sovereignty because policy options are being imposed from outside. And in addition, internally, it is facing the real danger of opponents of the ANC imposing populist measures simply because we are going through this deep economic crisis. I also do not think he is the man for the moment because he is credited as being one of the best negotiators in the country. I've never been certain whether he is one of the best negotiators in South Africa or whether he's one of the worst serial compromisers in the country. Now, given where we are as far as race relations, as they manifest in the increased support for the Freedom Front Plus and how the DA has lost both black and white supporters, and amongst white supporters, it has lost the Afrikaner vote to the Freedom Front Plus, which indicates that the gap in the reality and aspiration of reconciliation lies precisely in a South Africa 25 years later that is struggling to reconcile at a racial level. In other words, we have reached a moment, I think, where the best we can achieve under Ramaphosa, and possibly his successor too, is what I call peaceful non-reconciliation. Because reconciliation is not on the agenda at the moment. Is he the man who can turn that around? No, I don't think so. And in part, what he can or cannot do will be governed by the state of the ANC. And the state of the ANC limits his options to the extent that he cannot govern without the consent of internal opposition in the party.
A loss of 5 seats in parliament has been presented as a calamity, with predictions of DA leader Mmusi Maimane being removed as leader. Do you think issues such as black economic empowerment and the expropriation of land without compensation alienated both white and black voters?
What the EFF succeeded in doing is pulling the ANC away from the center, further towards the left, when it comes to issues such as so-called radical economic transformation and expropriation of land without compensation. In turn, the ANC pulled the DA towards the center, so the DA itself was pulled towards the left. So as the DA tried to manufacture a response to both the ANC and the EFF, it alienated both black and white voters, because it became even more ambiguous in its policy stance on issues, for instance, such as BEE. So you find a DA that says it is convinced that race remains a predictor of advantage and disadvantage in South Africa, but remains ambiguous on policy issues such as land expropriation and black economic empowerment. By so doing, it succeeds in alienating the Afrikaner white voter and in alienating the black voter at the same time. Now, as far as the fate of Mmusi Maimane is concerned, I don't think Mmusi Maimane will be the leader of the DA at the time of the local government elections in 2021. If he is, that will show just how poor the quality of leadership that is available to the DA is, and therefore its failure to find an alternative to Maimane.
The Freedom Front Plus doubled its support of a lower base and powered up to number 5 out of 14 parties represented in the National Assembly. Can you briefly explain to us why do you say the Freedom Front Plus benefited quite handsomely from the DA's loss, and its gain should concern us all?
Well, I think the Freedom Front Plus benefited from an attempt by the DA to misrepresent itself to both black and white voters. To white voters, the DA continued sending the message that it is a party of narrow white interests. To black voters, it sent the message that it was serious about change, particularly on issues such as redress. Now, of course, this was an attempt to have its cake and eat it, because it wanted to keep its white support base while it is making promises to black voters in an attempt to attract them to be members and to be voters for the DA. This is like a hunter who reaches the forest and sees 2 animals. And what does he do? He chases both of them and catches neither. This is what the Freedom Front Plus benefited from, because in losing its black support, the DA lost that black support to parties such as the EFF and the ANC. But in losing its white Afrikaner support, that white Afrikaner support went to the Freedom Front Plus, and that has implications for the country, because it means actually the non-racialism project is dead in the water. The reconciliation project is dead in the water. But it also means that alienation is not only at an interracial level, but it is also at an intraracial level. Because what you see in support for the Freedom Front Plus is a split between Afrikaner voters, white Afrikaner voters, and the rest of the white support base of the DA.
The economic freedom fighters did very well to garner 10% of the vote nationally, being the official opposition in 3 provinces, Mpumalanga, Northwest, and Limpopo. Why do you say the EFF could have done better in Limpopo and the Northwest?
I think the EFF should have done much better overall. I know that in the column, I may have argued that it should have done better at provincial level in provinces such as Limpopo and the Northwest. But my reading now of the results is that while they should be happy with the almost 11% they achieved in the national election, even there, they should have done much better. For me, I think the EFF would have been much happier at around 13%. Or even 15%, which is what they thought they would get. At provincial level, yes, it is now the official opposition in Mpumalanga, Limpopo, and the Northwest. But in Limpopo and the Northwest, they really should have done much better. And the question is, what happened? I think in Limpopo, we may have erred as analysts in thinking that the Malema factor is an advantage to the EFF. Maybe it's not. Maybe it is a disadvantage to the extent that the perception that he looted, or was part of those who looted in Limpopo when he was the leader of the Youth League, is a perception, or maybe a perception that still holds strongly, which means he is therefore not an advantage for the EFF in Limpopo, maybe quite a disadvantage. But speaking generally, I think the EFF has become quite abrasive or even arrogant in its approach. And therefore, in a country that is socially conservative and suffers from very healthy levels of ageism, that lends itself to the perception that the EFF is juvenile. So while I think many voters, if not most, love what the EFF is saying, especially on the political economy of race, they do not trust that it is ready to govern.
Malema said the EFF's goal in Parliament is to uproot the anti-black racism in the financial sector because black workers are the most vulnerable in the workplace. Do you think this strategy will help the EFF gain more support, especially from black voters?
Well, I think the EFF is zooming in on the financial sector because of the financialization of the economy, not only domestically, but globally. And that is why sometimes I argue that actually it is not through the public coffers that you should pay politicians globally, but it is banks that must pay politicians because globally they tend to act more in the interests of banks than they do in the interests of ordinary citizens. Maybe it is in that context that he says that. But I think we need to look at this in a much broader fashion because while people may talk about white monopoly capital, that in itself does not tell us much about the state of our economy. The truth about the South African economy is that it is monopolized not just by white capital. It is monopolized by white people, period. And that's what must change about the structure of this economy. So in whatever sector you find yourself in, that reality, if you're black, is going to manifest. It's going to stare you in the face. So there's a certain level of corruption that has happened in order to make sure that for a certain layer of the black middle class, its interest becomes synonymous with the interest of white capital. While that has happened, the rest of the people, the black majority, suffer social and economic conditions that are a direct product of the reality that there is a white monopoly, not just white monopoly capital in our economy that determines their social and economic position in this country.
And lastly, President Cyril Ramaphosa is between a rock and hard place when it comes to deciding who will be serving in his cabinet. South Africans expect Ramaphosa to stay away from individuals such as ANC Deputy President David Mabuza and others who are implicated in corruption. Do you think Ramaphosa will do away with Mabuza in his cabinet?
Well, I think it's between a rock, a boulder, and a hard place. And remember, it is the prerogative of the president to appoint cabinet ministers. But it is not the sole prerogative of the president. His final decision will in part be his own, in part will be informed by dynamics inside the ANC, which means inside the ANC, he will have to go in there with his patronage pot and give both to his supporters and his opponents. He also has to pander to interests outside the ANC, particularly those whose interests in the global and domestic economy are very strong. Now, the question is, how is he going to balance that? I think what will happen is that the economic cluster will, under Ramaphosa, remain the most important cluster. And it's not important to the extent that it must deal with poverty, unemployment, and inequality. The economic cluster has always served the same purpose since 1994, except for a brief moment when Jacob Zuma fired in Nhlanhla. But otherwise, if you exclude that moment, the economic cluster in the ANC or in the ANC government has existed to serve primarily interests other than those of those who are oppressed during apartheid. If it continues in that vein, investors, ratings agencies, capital will be happy. And I think they will be with the appointments it's going to make in the economic cluster. The rest of the positions in cabinet are ANC positions. And that's where he'll have to balance interests in a way that makes both his supporters and his opponents happy. Now, there are names you're going to see in that cabinet that you do not want to see. But he has no choice but to appoint some of them. For instance, I'd be surprised if Bathabile Dlamini is not in that cabinet because he cannot afford not to have Bathabile Dlamini in that cabinet. So if people think his patronage pot is empty, it's not. He must give something to his opponents. And therefore, the best he can do is a balance between the expectation of excellence on the part of individuals he will appoint on the one hand, and on the other, satisfying the interests of internal opposition inside the ANC. But whatever it does, no one in this country will be completely happy with the appointments he's going to make. As a political commentator, I still maintain that Ramaphosa is the weakest leader the ANC has ever elected, both because of objective conditions beyond his control and his own subjective weaknesses as a leader. But as a citizen, I cannot afford to be right about Ramaphosa. I therefore hope for my sake and the sake of my children, I am wrong.
That was political analyst Aubrey Matshiqi speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about his column, The People Have Spoken.